The crisp mountain air filled my lungs as I walked along the familiar trail near CLE Wood Cove. It was early September 2005, and I had been a park ranger at Crater Lake National Park for just over 4 years. My name is Ryan Holloway. At 32 years old, I thought I had experienced everything this majestic landscape had to offer. Little did I know, the events about to unfold would shatter my sense of reality and leave a permanent mark on my mind. The day started as any other. My routine patrol involved checking for illegal campsites and ensuring visitors respected the park's pristine environment. The sun was high, casting dappled shadows through towering pines, while the usual symphony of nature surrounded me. Rustling leaves, the distant call of a Steller's jay, and the occasional scurry of small animals in the underbrush. Pausing to sip from my water bottle, I admired the view of Crater Lake's deep blue waters peeking through a break in the trees. No matter how many times I saw it, the sight always took my breath away. I smiled, grateful to call this place my office. Yet as I continued my patrol, an unsettling feeling began to creep in. Something felt off, though I couldn't pinpoint what. The forest seemed quieter than usual, the air heavy with an unnatural stillness that set my nerves on edge. Dismissing it as paranoia, I pressed on. After all, this was Crater Lake, a serene haven. What could possibly go wrong here? Still, I found myself gripping my radio tighter as I ventured deeper into the woods. Later in the afternoon, I headed toward the park's northern section, a less frequented area that mainly attracted seasoned hikers. I usually enjoyed the solitude, far from the bustling crowds near the lodge and viewpoints. But today, the solitude felt oppressive. The trees seemed to loom over me, their branches resembling gnarled fingers. Shadows deepened despite the bright sun overhead. Rounding a bend in the trail, I froze. A foul odor hit me, making my stomach churn. The stench of decay was unmistakable. But this was different, far worse than anything I'd encountered before. It wasn't the usual smell of a dead animal or rotting vegetation. This was sharper, more potent, clinging to the back of my throat. Fighting the urge to gag, I grabbed my radio. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Holloway. I've picked up a strong odor of decay near the northern trail. Going to investigate. Over." The response crackled through. "Copy that, Holloway. Be careful out there. Report back in 15 minutes. Over." "Will do. Holloway out." Taking a deep breath, immediately regretting it because of the stench, I followed the odor. Each step heightened my sense of dread. The forest was eerily silent, as if holding its breath. Pushing through a dense thicket, the smell became overpowering. Then I saw it, a shape on the ground, partially obscured by fallen leaves. My heart pounded as I approached, realizing I was about to confront something far worse than I'd ever imagined. The clearing revealed a body. The victim, a man in his mid-30s, lay face down, half buried in damp leaves and pine needles. He was dressed in shredded hiking gear. From a distance, the torn clothes suggested a violent animal attack. But as I drew closer, it became clear this was no ordinary predator. The wounds were too precise, too deliberate. Long, deep gashes exposed white bone in some areas, and his limbs were bent at unnatural angles. Suppressing a wave of nausea, I fumbled for my radio. "Dispatch, this is Holloway. I found a body. Male, mid-30s. It's bad. Really bad. Sending coordinates now. We need the sheriff and a forensic team ASAP. Copy that, Holloway. Stay put. Backup is on the way." Though I knew better than to disturb the scene, I felt compelled to take a closer look. Donning latex gloves, I approached the body. The man's skin was grayish-white, mottled with dark bruises, suggesting he had been dead for days, maybe weeks. Steeling myself, I gently rolled the body over. The face staring back at me would haunt my nightmares forever. It was a mangled mess of torn flesh and exposed muscle. The eyes were gone, leaving empty sockets that seemed to accuse me. The mouth hung open in a grotesque scream, teeth bared in terror. But the cuts on his face and neck were what truly chilled me. Dozens, maybe hundreds of small, deliberate incisions, forming intricate patterns, almost like writing. My mind reeled. This wasn't the random savagery of an animal. Whatever had done this defied explanation. And deep down, I knew this discovery was only the beginning of a nightmare that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the natural world. This was methodical, intentional. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. What could have done this? My eyes darted around the clearing, half expecting to see some monstrous creature lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing, only the eerie silence of the forest and the mutilated corpse at my feet. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as I waited for backup to arrive. Every snapping twig and rustling leaf sent jolts of adrenaline through my system. My hand gripped my sidearm, a weapon I'd never had to use in all my years as a ranger. Faced with evidence of such brutality, I felt woefully unprepared. After what felt like an eternity, the sound of approaching vehicles broke the suffocating silence. Relief washed over me as Sheriff Donovan and his deputies arrived. The sheriff, a grizzled veteran of law enforcement, took one look at the body and let out a low whistle. "Jesus H. Christ," he muttered, his face pale. "What the hell happened here?" I shook my head, struggling to form words. I I don't know, sir. I've never seen anything like this. It's not an animal attack, at least not any animal I know of. Donovan's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the scene. "No, this ain't no animal. This is something else entirely." He turned to his deputies. "Secure the area. I want this entire section of the park locked down tight. Nobody in or out without my say-so." As the forensics team began their grim work, Donovan pulled me aside. "Holloway, I need you to keep this quiet for now. Last thing we need is panic spreading through the park. You didn't see anyone or anything suspicious while you were out here?" I shook my head again. "Nothing out of the ordinary, until I found this." The sheriff nodded, his expression grave. "All right, I want you to do another sweep of the area. Maybe our killer left some tracks we can follow. But be careful, you hear me? Whatever did this might still be out there." As I set off into the surrounding forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The trees seemed to close in around me, their shadows stretching and darkening with each passing minute. The forest, once familiar and welcoming, now felt alien and hostile. Little did I know, this was only the beginning. The horrors that awaited me in the coming days would test the limits of my sanity and challenge everything I thought I knew about the natural world. The following days passed in a blur of activity. The discovery of the mutilated body triggered a firestorm of investigation and speculation. Park officials scrambled to keep the incident under wraps, but rumors had already begun to circulate among staff and observant visitors. Sleep eluded me. Nightmares of that grotesque face and its ritualistic wounds haunted me every time I closed my eyes. Those empty sockets stared back in accusation, as if blaming me for some unknown crime. On the third night, I was on late patrol. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. The forest felt different now, no longer the safe haven I had grown to love. Every shadow seemed alive with potential danger. Every rustling leaf made my pulse quicken. As I walked along Crater Lake's shoreline, my flashlight danced across the obsidian waters. Then I heard it. A scream, distant, unmistakable, and filled with raw terror. It was abruptly cut short, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. My heart raced as I radioed in. "Dispatch, this is Holloway. I just heard a scream near the eastern shore, requesting backup. I'm going to investigate." "Copy that, Holloway. Backup is on the way. Be careful out there." I knew I should wait for support, but something compelled me to move forward. The memory of that mutilated body spurred me on. If someone was out there in danger, I couldn't just stand by. Flashlight in hand, I plunged into the forest. The underbrush grabbed at my legs, slowing my progress. The air grew heavy, oppressive, and filled with that same sickly sweet odor of decay that I'd smelled before. Emerging into a small clearing, I immediately wished I hadn't. My flashlight revealed a scene of unimaginable carnage. Another body, or what was left of it, lay before me. The torso had been split open, ribs splayed outward like some grotesque flower. The lower half was gone, as if it had never existed. I staggered back, bile rising in my throat. This was fresh. Whatever had done this was still nearby. As if in answer to my thoughts, a twig snapped somewhere behind me. I whirled around, hand flying to my sidearm. The flashlight beam darted across the trees, searching for the source of the sound. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something, a shadow darker than the surrounding night, moving with unnatural speed. "This is Park Ranger Holloway," I called out, my voice trembling, despite my effort to sound authoritative. "Identify yourself." Silence. Then from somewhere in the darkness came a sound that would haunt me forever. A laugh. Low, guttural, and utterly inhuman, it echoed through the trees, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I ran. Pride and duty be damned. I ran as fast as my legs could carry me. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me, but I didn't dare slow down. The laugh followed me, growing louder and closer with each step. Bursting out onto the main road, gasping for breath, I spotted the flashing lights of approaching vehicles. Backup had finally arrived. As Sheriff Donovan and his deputies piled out, I tried to explain what I'd seen and heard, but no words could adequately convey the sheer horror of my experience. "All right, Holloway," Donovan said, his tone firm. "We're going to check it out, but you're staying here. You've been through enough tonight." As the search party disappeared into the woods, I slumped against a patrol car, my mind reeling. What was out there? What kind of creature could do such things? And why did I have the sickening feeling this was far from over? The night dragged on, and eventually the search party returned. They found the second body, just as I'd described it. But there was no sign of the thing I'd heard, no tracks, no trace of its passage. It was as if it had vanished into thin air. As dawn broke over Crater Lake, the light bathed the park in a deceptive calm. Yet I couldn't shake the growing certainty that we were dealing with something far beyond our understanding. Something ancient, something evil. And I had a terrible feeling it was only getting started. The days that followed were a blur of increased patrols, tense meetings, and sleepless nights. The park remained open, but heightened security measures were put in place. We couldn't close it entirely without raising too many questions, but we did our best to steer visitors away from the areas where the bodies had been found. I threw myself into my work, pushing myself to exhaustion in an attempt to keep the nightmares at bay. But even in my waking hours, I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. Every time I ventured into the forest, I felt eyes on me, boring into the back of my skull. More than once, I caught myself jumping at shadows, my hand flying to my sidearm at the slightest provocation. The forest, once a place of solace, now felt like hostile territory. It was on one such patrol, about a week after the second body was discovered, that things took an even stranger turn. I was deep in the northern part of the park, an area we had largely cordoned off from the public. The day was overcast, with a heavy mist clinging to the treetops and obscuring the distant peaks. As I made my way along a narrow game trail, I noticed something odd. The forest had fallen silent again, but this time it was different. Instead of the oppressive, threatening silence I'd experienced before, this felt expectant, as if the very trees were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. Then I heard it, a whisper so faint I almost missed it. I froze, straining my ears to catch it again. There, barely audible but unmistakable, words in a language I didn't recognize. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, carried on the wind itself. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding thin and weak in the eerie stillness. "Is someone there?" The whispering intensified, growing louder but no more intelligible. It was joined by other voices, a cacophony of murmurs pressing in on me from all sides. I spun in place, trying to locate the source, but it was futile. The voices were all around me, in the trees, in the ground, in the very air I breathed. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood there, heart pounding, sweat beading on my forehead despite the cool air. What the hell had just happened? As I tried to collect myself, I noticed something on the ground a few feet away. Approaching cautiously, I saw it was a small, intricately carved wooden figurine. It depicted some kind of creature, vaguely humanoid, but with elongated limbs and a head that was decidedly not human. The craftsmanship was exquisite, every detail rendered with painstaking care. I reached down to pick it up, but as my fingers brushed its surface, a jolt of electricity surged through my body. Images flashed through my mind. Ancient forests, darker and more primeval than anything I'd ever seen. Strange, shadowy figures moving through the undergrowth. And something else, something vast and terrifying that lurked just beyond the edge of perception. I jerked my hand back, gasping. The figurine lay innocently on the forest floor, but I couldn't shake the feeling it was somehow watching me. With trembling hands, I pulled out an evidence bag from my kit and carefully scooped up the object without touching it directly. As I sealed the bag, a chill wind whipped through the trees, carrying with it the faintest echo of those otherworldly whispers. I didn't wait around to hear more. I practically ran back to my vehicle, the evidence bag clutched tightly to my chest. Back at the ranger station, I hesitated before reporting my find. The rational part of my mind argued that I should turn the figurine over to Sheriff Donovan immediately. But something held me back, a nagging feeling that this object was meant for me, that it held answers to questions I hadn't even begun to formulate. In the end, I compromised. I logged the discovery of an unidentified wooden object in my patrol report, but kept the details vague. The figurine itself I locked away in my locker, telling myself I'd hand it over to the authorities in the morning, after I'd had a chance to examine it more closely. That night, as I tossed and turned in my bed, unable to sleep, my thoughts kept returning to the strange artifact. What was it? Where had it come from? And why did I feel so drawn to it? At around 2 a.m., I gave up on sleep. Dressing quickly, I made my way back to the ranger station. The night was eerily still, the usual chorus of nocturnal creatures conspicuously absent. Inside the station, I retrieved the figurine from my locker. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, it seemed even more intricate, more alien. I found myself tracing the contours of the carved creature with my eyes, marveling at the craftsmanship. And then, almost without realizing it, I was reaching out to touch it again. As my fingertips made contact with the smooth wood, the world around me seemed to blur and shift. The fluorescent lights flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. But I wasn't in the ranger station anymore, or at least it didn't feel like I was. I found myself in a vast, primordial forest. The trees towered impossibly high, their canopies lost in a mist that seemed to glow with an inner light. The air was thick and humid, filled with the buzz of insects and the calls of creatures I couldn't identify. And there, moving through the underbrush with fluid, inhuman grace, were the figures I'd glimpsed in my earlier vision. They were tall, far taller than any human, and their presence radiated an overwhelming sense of dread. Animal, no predator that could be categorized or understood. This was something ancient, something beyond the realm of human comprehension. The arrival of federal agents brought a small semblance of relief, but it was fleeting. They came in unmarked vehicles, clad in black tactical gear, and their demeanor was as cold and clinical as the night air in Crater Lake. Their leader, a man who introduced himself only as Agent Carter, wasted no time taking control of the situation. His piercing blue eyes and sharp features gave him an air of authority that silenced any objections before they could be voiced. He listened intently as Sheriff Donovan and I recounted the events, his expression betraying nothing. "You're saying it defied physics," Carter said, more as a statement than a question, after I described the creature's speed and resilience. "And it had the ability to manipulate objects like this figurine you found?" I nodded, feeling a chill creep up my spine. It wasn't just the figurine. It felt like it was manipulating reality itself. Carter exchanged a glance with one of his agents, a woman who seemed to be taking detailed notes. "We'll need to see this artifact," he said finally. I hesitated. The figurine was locked away in the evidence room, but even the thought of handling it again made my stomach churn. Still, I led them to it. When Carter saw the object, his reaction was subtle but unmistakable. A tightening of the jaw, a flicker of recognition in his otherwise impassive gaze. "This isn't the first time we've encountered something like this," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone in the room. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice tinged with equal parts curiosity and dread. Carter's eyes met mine, and for a moment I saw something in them, something that looked a lot like fear. "Let's just say there are things in this world, and others that don't adhere to our understanding of reality. Things that have been here longer than humanity. This figurine is a tether, a link to whatever it is you're dealing with, and it's far from the only one." The implications of his words hit me like a freight train. "Are you saying this thing isn't alone?" Carter didn't answer directly. Instead, he turned to his team. "Secure the perimeter. I want every inch of this park monitored. If it moves, I want to know about it. The days that followed were a blur of activity. The federal agents set up a command center in the park's visitor center, their equipment far more advanced than anything I'd ever seen. They installed motion sensors, infrared cameras, and even drones to patrol the more inaccessible areas of the forest. Despite their efforts, the creature remained elusive. Every so often, there would be a glimpse, a shadow caught on a camera feed, a fleeting movement detected by a sensor, but it always seemed to stay one step ahead. Meanwhile, the whispers returned, not just in the forest, but in my dreams. They grew louder, more insistent, speaking in that alien tongue that made my head throb and my heart race. And always in the background of those dreams was the creature, or rather its vast otherworldly master, the eldritch being I had glimpsed during my vision. One night I woke with a start, my heart pounding. The whispers had been so loud, so clear, that I half expected the creature to be standing at the foot of my bed. Instead, I found the figurine sitting on my nightstand, though I was certain I had locked it away in the evidence room. I stared at it, paralyzed by fear and fascination. It seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight, its carved features shifting subtly as if alive. I knew then that this was far from over. The figurine, the creature, the visions, they were all connected, threads in a tapestry that stretched far beyond Crater Lake. The final straw came a week later when a team of agents vanished without a trace during a routine patrol. Their equipment was found scattered across the forest floor, but there was no sign of the men themselves. It was as if the forest had swallowed them whole. Carter called an emergency meeting that night. "We're dealing with something beyond containment," he admitted, his usual stoic demeanor cracking under the weight of the situation. "Evacuating the park isn't enough. We need to consider more drastic measures." "Like what?" Donovan asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Carter hesitated. "We're looking into options, but I need you all to understand. We're not just fighting for this park or the people in it. We're fighting for reality itself." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. As I looked around the room, at the grim faces of my colleagues and the federal agents, I realized the truth. Whatever had awakened in Crater Lake was far bigger than any of us, and it was only a matter of time before it broke free entirely. In the days that followed, I found myself standing at the edge of the lake, staring into its dark, unyielding depths. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from below, something vast and ancient and patient. And as the first tendrils of mist began to rise from the water, I knew one thing for certain. The nightmare was just beginning, nothing I had ever seen or imagined. An immense cathedral-like edifice that seemed both alive and constructed. Its surface writhed with patterns and glyphs that shifted and pulsed with an otherworldly rhythm. The structure seemed to hum, a deep resonance that I could feel vibrating through my body. I activated the underwater camera, its light cutting through the murky depths and illuminating more of the structure. The carvings and shapes on its surface seemed to respond to the light, shifting and twisting as if aware of my presence. I approached cautiously, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But something drew me forward, a compulsion I couldn't resist. As I neared the base of the structure, I saw an opening. It was an archway tall and foreboding, its edges lined with undulating, vein-like patterns that glowed faintly. The psychic pressure grew almost unbearable, and the fragmented images in my mind coalesced into something clearer. A vision of the being I had seen in my earlier hallucination, vast and incomprehensible, waiting just beyond the threshold of this place. Taking a deep breath through my regulator, I pushed forward into the opening. Inside, the temperature of the water seemed to drop further, and the glow from the walls intensified, casting everything in a sickly, pulsating light. The interior was a labyrinth of corridors and chambers, each more alien and incomprehensible than the last. The walls seemed alive, shifting and pulsing as though breathing, and the psychic weight became so intense that I could barely think. In the central chamber, I found it, a massive, pulsating mass that seemed to anchor the entire structure. It was not the creature I had seen before, but something even more vast, its form constantly shifting between solid and liquid, organic and crystalline. Tendrils of light and energy extended from it, connecting to the walls and the surrounding structures, as if it were the heart of this entire system. And then it noticed me. The psychic wave that hit me was like nothing I had ever experienced. It was not a message or a thought, but pure, unfiltered presence. A being so ancient, so vast, that my mind could barely comprehend its existence. It was a predator, a god, and a force of nature all at once. And it was aware of me. I was frozen, unable to move as the mass began to shift, extending a tendril of energy toward me. Time seemed to stretch as the tendril neared, and I knew instinctively that if it touched me, I would cease to exist. Not just in the physical sense, but utterly erased from reality. In a final act of desperation, I ripped the camera from my belt and hurled it at the tendril. The camera's light and energy seemed to disrupt the connection for a moment, and the tendril recoiled. Seizing the opportunity, I turned and swam as fast as I could, the psychic pressure now accompanied by a deep, resonant roar that seemed to shake the very water around me. I reached the surface just as the boat was about to drift away, hauling myself aboard with the last of my strength. Gasping for air, I looked back at the lake. The water was calm again, as if nothing had happened, but I could feel the presence below, watching, waiting. Back on shore, Dr. Reeves and the others were waiting. I handed over the camera, my hands trembling. "You need to see this," I managed to say before collapsing to the ground. As they reviewed the footage, the expressions on their faces shifted from curiosity to horror. "This changes everything," Dr. Reeves whispered, her voice shaking. "We're not just dealing with a creature. This is something much, much bigger." The footage was sent to the highest levels of government, and within hours the park was sealed off entirely. Military convoys arrived, their presence a stark contrast to the serene beauty of Crater Lake. But even as they set up their perimeter and brought in heavy equipment, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wouldn't be enough. Whatever was down there wasn't just ancient or powerful, it was patient. It had waited eons to awaken, and now that it was stirring, nothing we could do would stop it. As I watched the sun set over the lake, its surface glinting innocently in the fading light, I realized that this was just the beginning. Something had been set in motion, something far beyond our control, and I knew deep down that it was only a matter of time before it reached out again. Building's foundation. It contained faded newspapers, a bottle of Coca-Cola, and a letter from a kid who dreamed of being an astronaut. We all marveled at how strange and poignant it was, a glimpse into a long-past world where the Cold War loomed, and space was still a frontier of unbridled optimism. As the fire burned lower, the conversation shifted to the eerie. It was inevitable, really. Isolated in the wilderness, surrounded by the vast darkness of the Adirondacks, it felt natural to swap ghost stories and urban legends. Nate brought up the Adirondack Lights, a local phenomenon involving strange orbs that supposedly floated through the forest at night. "They say they're spirits," Nate said, his face lit eerily by the firelight, "guiding lost souls or leading them astray, depending on their mood." Cal scoffed but couldn't help shivering slightly. "Probably swamp gas or something," he muttered, taking a swig of his beer. "Not much swamp gas up here, buddy," Nate replied with a grin. I shared a story about the Wendigo, a creature from Algonquin folklore that supposedly prowled the woods during harsh winters, devouring those who strayed too far from the safety of their homes. "Why is it always cannibal monsters with you, August?" Cal teased. "You teach high schoolers, not survival classes." "Hey, history is full of creepy stuff," I shot back. "You should see what I leave out of the lectures." Eventually, we all fell quiet, lulled by the rhythmic crackle of the dying fire and the serenity of the lake. But just as I was starting to drift off in my chair, a sound shattered the peace. It was faint at first, a distant wail that carried over the water. Low and mournful, it didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. Nate and I exchanged uneasy glances while Cal, ever the skeptic, shrugged it off as a loon, or maybe the wind. But as the wail grew louder, closer, it became clear that this was no bird or breeze. It had an almost human quality, like someone crying out in pain or grief. "Could be someone lost in the woods," Nate suggested, his voice uncertain. "Or someone playing a prank," Cal said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. We grabbed flashlights and decided to investigate, leaving the cozy warmth of the fire for the cold, moonlit expanse of the lakefront. The sound seemed to be coming from the woods on the far side of the lake, across a narrow stretch of water. "There's a canoe down by the dock," Nate offered. "We can paddle over and check it out." "Are you serious?" Cal groaned. "This is how horror movies start, you know." "Relax," Nate said, already heading to the dock. "It's probably nothing." Against my better judgment, I followed, and Cal grudgingly trailed behind. The canoe was an old, battered thing, but it floated. The three of us squeezed in, our flashlights flickering as we paddled across the eerily still water. The sound grew louder as we approached the opposite shore, more desperate and guttural. My heart pounded in my chest, a mix of fear and adrenaline. When we finally reached the shore, the wailing stopped. The silence was deafening, the kind that presses in on you and makes every tiny sound seem amplified. Our flashlights scanned the trees, casting long, shifting shadows, but there was no sign of anyone, or anything. "See? Probably a coyote or something," Cal said, though his voice wavered. But just as we turned to head back to the canoe, we saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the trees, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed too long and a head that tilted at an odd angle, as if it were studying us. "Hello?" Nate called out, his voice shaking. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, motionless, its silhouette almost blending into the shadows of the forest. And then, with a sudden, jerky movement, it stepped forward. We didn't wait to see what it wanted. Adrenaline took over, and we sprinted back to the canoe, paddling furiously toward the safety of the cabin. Behind us, the wailing started again, louder and more frenzied, echoing across the lake like a cry from another world. We didn't sleep that night, huddling together in the cabin with every light we could find turned on. The sound continued until just before dawn, fading away as the first rays of sunlight broke over the mountains. The next morning, we packed up and left without a word. None of us spoke about what we'd seen, not then, and not in the years that followed. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that sound, the mournful wail of something that doesn't belong to this world. And I wonder, not for the first time, what would have happened if we'd stayed to find out. That night, everything changed. We were back at the cabin, finishing off the last of the sandwiches and sipping on what was left of the beer. Nate had lit a roaring fire in the old stone hearth, and the flickering flames cast long shadows that danced across the wooden walls. The earlier laughter had given way to a subdued quiet, a tension none of us could quite articulate. The sound started again just after midnight. It began with a low, almost imperceptible hum, like the faint thrum of a distant engine. Cal was the first to notice, cocking his head to one side, his expression tight. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. We strained to listen, and then it came, a deliberate, methodical thud against the cabin wall. Nate was on his feet in an instant, grabbing the mag light and heading for the door, but I grabbed his arm. "Wait, what if it's not just an animal?" He hesitated, looking at me, then at Cal, who had silently reached for the fireplace poker again. The sound came again, louder this time. Thud, thud, thud. Against my better judgment, we decided to look. Opening the cabin door slowly, we were met with a rush of cold air, sharp and biting. The maglight's beam swept across the porch and into the surrounding darkness. For a moment, nothing moved. Then, from the edge of the woods, a pair of eyes reflected the light, glowing an unnatural, almost electric blue. "What the hell is that?" Cal muttered, his voice shaky. The eyes didn't blink. They didn't move. And then the sound came again, not from the eyes in the woods, but from the side of the cabin. Thud. It was closer now. We spun toward the sound, the flashlight catching the edge of the wall. A deep scratch ran along the wood, fresh and jagged, like the marks we had seen on the trees earlier that day. Nate swore under his breath, backing up toward the door. "This isn't a bear," he said, his bravado evaporating. A sudden rush of movement came from the woods. Whatever had been watching us from the tree line darted away, the glowing eyes vanishing as quickly as they had appeared. We retreated into the cabin, locking the door behind us. The firelight seemed feeble against the oppressive darkness outside. Cal, ever the joker, didn't even try to lighten the mood. We sat in silence, ears straining for any sound, hearts pounding. Then just as we started to think it might be over, a new sound filled the air. A low, guttural growl, resonant and unearthly. It came from the direction of the woodpile just outside the cabin. None of us slept that night. We were sitting by the fire, passing around a bottle of Jack Daniels that Cal had saved for a special occasion, when we heard the noise again. This time it was closer, almost right outside the cabin. The sound wasn't just footsteps, it was deliberate, as if whatever it was wanted us to hear it. Nate, fueled by liquid courage or sheer recklessness, grabbed his flashlight and headed toward the door. "I'm going to find out what's messing with us," he declared. The temperature had dropped and our breaths came out in white clouds. But when we searched, there was nothing, just the dense darkness and the endless wall of trees surrounding the cabin. Cal tried to dismiss it, suggesting pranksters from a campground. But we knew there were no campgrounds for miles. We were supposed to be alone. That night, unease hung in the air. The Jack Daniels bottle was significantly lighter as we finally turned in. I lay awake listening to the cabin's normal sounds. The creak of old wood, the groan of cold floorboards. Then around 3 a.m., I heard it again. Footsteps on the porch. Heavy, deliberate. The boards groaned under the weight. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly grabbed the aluminum bat I'd brought for campfire games. It felt cold and inadequate in my hands. The footsteps moved back and forth across the porch. Pacing. I tiptoed to the window and cautiously peered out. A dark shape moved across the porch, something massive that seemed to absorb the faint light of the cloudy night. Nate and Cal emerged from their rooms, armed with makeshift weapons. Nate with his mag light, Cal with a fire poker. We didn't speak, just exchanged nervous glances as Nate moved toward the door. His hand shook as he turned the knob. The creak of the door seemed deafening. The air outside was beyond cold, as if every bit of warmth had been drained from the world. The night was still, no wind, no animals, not even the gentle lapping of the lake water. Flashlights cut through the oppressive darkness, but the beams felt weak, almost smothered by the surrounding blackness. There was nothing out there, or so it seemed. At dawn, we found them. Footprints circling the entire cabin. Each was massive, 16 inches long and 8 inches wide. They weren't animal tracks, and as a former Boy Scout, I'd seen plenty. They were almost human, but grotesquely large and deep, as if whatever made them weighed hundreds of pounds. Nate wanted to leave, but Cal's curiosity won out. Against my better judgment, I agreed to stay. The unease only grew as the day wore on. We didn't stray far from the cabin. Even Cal, usually full of stories and jokes, was unusually quiet. As night fell, we built the fire higher than necessary, hoping its light would keep whatever was out there at bay. Around midnight, the footsteps returned, circling the cabin in a deliberate, unhurried pace. Gripping our weapons, we stepped outside. The sound led us to the edge of the woods, where our flashlights caught something that froze us in place. A figure, partially obscured behind a massive pine. It was tall, at least 8 feet, and broad, its body covered in matted fur. But it was the eyes that haunted me, reflective like an animal's, but filled with an unsettling, almost human intelligence. It didn't move, just watched us. Nate, still riding adrenaline, took a step forward, but I grabbed his arm, whispering, "Don't. We don't know what it is." The figure held its ground for what felt like hours but was likely only seconds. Then it backed away into the darkness, never turning, its eyes the last thing to disappear. We bolted back to the cabin, barricading the doors with whatever we could find. None of us slept. The footsteps continued all night, punctuated by occasional scratching on the walls. At first light, we threw our gear into Nate's truck and left without looking back. The drive home was silent, each of us lost in thought. We never really talked about that night again. Nate moved to Arizona the following year, and Cal changed careers, leaving his radio job for something safer and quieter. Our friendship didn't end, but it was never the same. Years later, I found myself looking up strange sightings in the Adirondacks. Stories of local legends and cryptids filled the screen, but none seemed as real as what we encountered that night. Sometimes I pull out the photos of the footprints, the scratched trees, but I always put them away. No explanation could ever account for those eyes. that gaze that felt like it pierced straight into my soul. I retired last year, my students gifting me a camping set as a farewell. It's still in its packaging. Every now and then, I think about using it, heading back to the mountains. But then I remember those eyes in the darkness, and I decide my backyard is adventure enough. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Not all who wander are lost, but some things in this world want us to get lost into the unknown, where they've been waiting all along. Unlike me, he had managed to land a steady job right out of college, working as an environmental consultant. He was living in Pittsburgh, a few hours away, and we tried to meet up every few months, usually for a hiking trip or a weekend of reminiscing about college days over beers. In early November of 2012, Jackson called me with an offer I couldn't refuse. He had scored a weekend pass to a private property in Pennsylvania that included miles of untouched forest, a cabin with all the amenities, and a secluded lake. The property belonged to one of his firm's wealthy clients, and Jackson assured me it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to explore some pristine wilderness. "You need a break," he said. "Come on, Bryce, fresh air, no deadlines and no emails. Just us, the woods, and a couple of beers." I hesitated. Work had been slow, and I wasn't sure I could justify taking a weekend off. But Jackson had a way of convincing me, and by Friday afternoon, I found myself throwing my gear into the trunk of my aging Honda Civic and heading east. The drive was long but beautiful. By the time I arrived at the property, the sun was setting, casting the forest in a warm, golden light. The cabin was incredible. 2 stories, a massive stone fireplace, and a wraparound porch that overlooked the lake. Jackson was already there, unloading supplies and grinning like a kid on Christmas morning. The first night was perfect. We grilled steaks on the porch, shared a bottle of bourbon, and talked late into the night. The woods were alive with the sounds of nature, and the lake reflected the moonlight like a mirror. I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in years. The next day we hiked the trails, spotting deer and wild turkeys, and even found an old abandoned hunting blind that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. Jackson was in his element, pointing out different types of trees and animal tracks, while I snapped photos on my phone, marveling at how untouched everything felt. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, a sense of unease began to creep in. The woods, which had felt so inviting during the day, now seemed to press in on us, the shadows stretching long and dark. It started with the noises. At first, it was just the occasional rustling of leaves or snapping of branches, which we chalked up to animals moving through the forest. But as the night wore on, the sounds grew louder and closer, heavy footsteps that didn't match the light, quick movements of deer or raccoons. By the time we went to bed, we were both on edge, though neither of us admitted it. The cabin's walls felt thin against the oppressive darkness outside, and every creak of the old wood made me jump. Sometime after midnight, I woke to the sound of something scraping against the cabin walls. My heart pounded as I strained to listen. The noise was slow and deliberate, moving along the length of the cabin before stopping near the front door. I reached over to shake Jackson awake, but he was already sitting up, his eyes wide and alert. "You hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, grabbing the flashlight from the nightstand. Together, we crept to the front door, our breaths shallow and our steps careful. The scraping noise had stopped, but now we could hear something else. A low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. Jackson motioned for me to stay back as he unlocked the door and pulled it open, just enough to shine the flashlight onto the porch. Nothing. The porch was empty, the surrounding woods still and silent. "Probably just an animal," Jackson said, though his voice lacked conviction. He shut the door and locked it again, and we spent the rest of the night sitting by the fireplace, jumping at every sound. The next morning we found the tracks. They were massive, larger than any bear print I'd ever seen, and the shape was all wrong, elongated with claw marks that dug deep into the earth. The tracks circled the cabin before disappearing into the woods. "Bryce," Jackson said, his voice shaking, "I don't think we're alone out here." We spent the day packing up, deciding to cut our trip short, but as we loaded the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. It wasn't until we were driving away that I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw it, a tall, shadowy figure standing at the edge of the tree line, watching us leave. I never told Jackson about what I saw, and he never asked. Bedroom, as if whatever was out there was circling the cabin, testing every side, probing for a weak point. The walls, which had seemed so sturdy in the daylight, now felt like little more than paper between us and whatever was outside. Jackson, I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my own heart. What do we do? He didn't answer right away, his face pale and strained as he stared toward the back of the cabin. Finally, he said, we stay inside, we keep the lights off, and we wait. Wait. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. I wanted to argue, to suggest running to the car and getting the hell out of there. But I knew he was right. We didn't know what was out there, and stepping outside felt like stepping into its trap. The crashes stopped, replaced by the sound of something scraping along the walls, slow and deliberate. It moved around the cabin, the noise faint at first but growing louder as it reached the front door. There it stopped, and for a long moment there was nothing but silence. And then came the knocking. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Not the random pounding of an animal, but something purposeful. Jesus Christ, I hissed, backing away from the door. Jackson grabbed the fire poker from the hearth, his knuckles white as he held it like a weapon. It's trying to scare us, he muttered, more to himself than to me. It's trying to get us to come out. The knocking stopped, and for a few minutes there was nothing. Just the two of us standing there in the dim cabin, every muscle in my body coiled tight, waiting for whatever came next. When it did, it was worse than I could have imagined. The thing, it had to be the thing, let out a sound that I can only describe as a scream. But it wasn't human, and it wasn't animal. It was something in between. A guttural, high-pitched wail that made my vision swim and my knees threatened to buckle. It was everywhere, vibrating through the walls, the floor, even the air around us. My hands flew to my ears, but it didn't help. I could feel the sound inside my skull, like it was trying to burrow into my brain. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. I could hear Jackson breathing heavily beside me, could feel the tension radiating off him like heat. Neither of us dared to move, as if any motion might draw its attention back to us. Eventually, exhaustion overtook fear. We barricaded the doors and windows as best we could, piling furniture against them in a makeshift defense. Then we sat in the center of the main room, backs against each other, fire poker and a kitchen knife clutched in our hands, and waited for morning. When the first light of dawn broke through the windows, we were already packed. We didn't even bother with breakfast, just threw our things into the car and sped down the overgrown road as fast as Jackson's old Jeep could manage. Neither of us spoke until we hit the main highway, the dense forest finally giving way to open fields. Only then did Jackson let out a long breath and say, "We're never going back there." I didn't argue. There was no need. Like they had been there for decades, while others seemed disturbingly fresh. Among the remains we found Jackson's flashlight, battered but still recognizable, and the torn remains of his jacket. The claw marks were everywhere, on the walls, the ceiling, even the scattered stones, as if whatever had made them had claimed this place as its lair. The deeper we went into the cave, the worse it got. The stench of decay was overwhelming, and the air felt heavy, oppressive, as though the weight of the forest above was pressing down on us. We found crude drawings etched into the stone walls, depicting strange, inhuman figures surrounded by what looked like screaming faces. Rai, our guide, whispered that the drawings matched the descriptions of local tribal warnings about the thing that never sleeps. The further we ventured, the more I felt like we were being watched, not just by whatever was in the cave, but by the forest itself, as if it were a living entity, aware of our intrusion and displeased by it. Then we heard it, the same guttural, bone-chilling scream that had haunted me for years, echoing through the tunnels and shaking the very ground. It was close, too close. Mike and Steve raised their rifles, their faces pale and slick with sweat, while Rai muttered a prayer under his breath. We didn't see it at first, only the shifting shadows and the sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps coming toward us. When it finally stepped into the light of our flashlights, I understood why Jackson's journal had been so frantic. It was massive, hunched but still towering over us, with long, sinewy limbs and a face that was a grotesque mockery of anything human. Its eyes were black voids, reflecting nothing, and its mouth was filled with jagged teeth that gleamed in the flashlight's beam. Its skin was a mottled gray, stretched taut over its skeletal frame, and its claws were exactly as I remembered, long, sharp, and impossibly strong. Mike fired first, the deafening blast of the rifle echoing in the confined space. The creature moved faster than I thought possible, the bullet grazing his shoulder but doing little more than enraging it. It let out another scream, louder this time, and charged. The next few moments were chaos, gunfire, screams, and the sickening sound of claws meeting flesh. I don't remember running, but I must have, because the next thing I knew, I was outside the cave, gasping for air and covered in blood. None of it mine. I turned back toward the entrance, but the sounds from within told me there was no going back. Whatever had happened in there, I was the only one left. I staggered back to camp, packed what I could carry, and started the long trek back to civilization. I didn't look back, not even when I heard the scream again, faint but unmistakable, carried on the wind. This was the final entry in Bryce Truan's recovered journal, found alongside his battered belongings near the forest edge. The authorities closed off the area surrounding the cave, citing safety concerns due to unstable ground. Officially, the disappearances are attributed to an animal attack or a tragic accident. But locals know better. They avoid the area entirely, and those who dare venture too close speak of hearing screams in the night, of seeing claw marks on trees, and of feeling an overwhelming sense of being watched. The Allegan National Forest holds its secrets well, and those who seek to uncover them rarely return. And routine, trying to forget what we had encountered in those woods. But some memories don't fade. They linger, haunting the edges of your thoughts, waiting for the quiet moments to resurface. I lost contact with Thad and Max over the years, partly because of the natural drift of time, and partly because of an unspoken agreement to leave that chapter of our lives closed. Yet every so often, I'd see something, an article about strange sightings in the Adirondacks, or a photograph of a dense forest, and feel the chill return. Then about a year ago, I received an envelope in the mail. There was no return address, just my name scrawled in handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was a single photograph, the abandoned campsite we'd found that day. But this time, it was different. The tent was gone, replaced by a circular pattern scorched into the earth, almost like a brand. Around the edge of the pattern were symbols I couldn't decipher, but they had a strange, almost hypnotic quality to them. In the center of the circle, there were claw marks, deep, jagged slashes that looked eerily similar to the ones we'd seen on the cabin's walls. No note, no explanation, just the photograph. Since then, the dreams have returned, more vivid than ever. I hear that unearthly growl, see those yellow eyes staring through the darkness, and feel the same suffocating fear I did that night in the cabin. I've thought about reaching out to Thad or Max, but something holds me back. A deep, primal fear that opening that door again might invite whatever it was into my life for good. So I keep the photograph locked in a drawer, buried beneath old bills and forgotten papers. And I try, as best as I can, to live a normal life. But some nights, when the wind howls just right or the shadows seem to move in ways they shouldn't, I can't help but wonder, what if it's still out there? What if it's watching? What if it's waiting? Childhood visits to my grandparents' house. This place oozed history. Jeremy had left the keys under a flower pot by the door, along with a note that simply read, "Enjoy the weekend, but whatever you do, don't stay in the attic after dark." I laughed when I read it, assuming it was Jeremy's idea of a joke. Darla, however, gave me a look that said she wasn't entirely amused. The first evening was uneventful. We unpacked, made dinner, and sat by the fireplace sipping wine while the forest outside grew dark and quiet. The kind of quiet that felt oppressive, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. The next morning, I couldn't wait to explore the attic. Armed with a flashlight and my restoration kit, I climbed the narrow stairs leading up to the small dusty space. The air grew colder as I ascended, and the musty smell intensified. The attic was cluttered with old trunks, furniture draped in white sheets, and boxes overflowing with forgotten keepsakes. And then I saw it, a typewriter sitting on an old wooden desk near a window covered with cobwebs. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen, a sleek black Underwood number 5, but with ornate carvings on its body that didn't match any production model I knew of. The carvings were intricate, almost hypnotic, depicting twisting vines and symbols that reminded me of something ancient and arcane. I ran my fingers over the keys. They felt cool to the touch, and when I pressed one, the type bar snapped forward with a sharp metallic click. But instead of hitting an ink ribbon, it struck the paper already loaded in the carriage. The paper was blank except for a single line of text. "Leave now, or it will find you." I stared at the words, my breath catching in my throat. The ink was fresh. The keys had moved. I was sure of it. Darla called up from downstairs, breaking the spell. "Find anything interesting?" I hesitated before shouting back, "Yeah, but it's nothing special. Just old junk." I didn't tell her about the typewriter. I didn't even tell myself what I had just seen, convincing myself that it was a trick of the light or an elaborate prank by Jeremy. But that night, as we lay in bed with the forest wind rattling the windows, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Then came the sound. At first it was faint, like the tap, tap, tap of rain on the roof, but it grew louder, sharper, rhythmic. It was the unmistakable sound of typewriter keys being struck. I bolted upright in bed. Darla stirred beside me. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. Her eyes widened and she nodded. The sound was coming from the attic. Grabbing the flashlight, I motioned for Darla to stay put. "Lock the door behind me," I said, my voice trembling. The creak of the attic stairs was deafening in the silence. The tapping continued, steady and relentless. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating the typewriter. It was typing, by itself. The keys moved with mechanical precision, and the carriage shifted with each completed line. I stepped closer, drawn despite every instinct screaming at me to run. On the paper were 2 words repeated over and over. "It's coming." Suddenly, the typewriter stopped, the silence almost as terrifying as the noise had been. And then I heard it, a low growl, deep and guttural, coming from somewhere in the woods outside. I stumbled back down the stairs, slamming the attic door behind me. Darla was waiting, pale and trembling. "We're leaving," I said, grabbing the car keys. We fled the cabin that night, not stopping until we were miles away. I tried to explain everything to Jeremy later, but he just laughed nervously and told me I was imagining things. But I know what I saw, and sometimes late at night I hear the sound of typewriter keys in my dreams, spelling out a warning I'll never forget. It's coming, as if trying to erase the unease that had settled over us. The forest felt alive in a way it hadn't the day before, an oppressive, watchful kind of alive. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves had us stopping in our tracks, scanning the underbrush for movement. When we returned to the cabin in the late afternoon, the shadows seemed to stretch farther and linger longer. I spent the evening tinkering with the Remington again, determined to understand the strange patterns carved into its surface. Darla kept herself busy in the kitchen, though I noticed she jumped at small noises, the creak of the floorboards, the rattle of the windows in the wind. As the sun dipped below the horizon and darkness enveloped the cabin once more, the uneasy atmosphere returned. We lit the fireplace and tried to lose ourselves in conversation, but the weight of the previous night hung between us like an unspoken threat. Just after midnight, the noise started again. It was faint at first, a soft tapping, like the sound of typewriter keys being struck. My stomach twisted as I exchanged a glance with Darla. Her eyes were wide, her face pale. "You hear it too, don't you?" I whispered. She nodded, her hand clutching mine. "It's coming from the attic." I grabbed the flashlight and the fire poker, motioning for Darla to stay put. "Lock the door behind me," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. The stairs to the attic creaked under my weight, each step echoing through the silent cabin. The tapping grew louder as I approached the door, rhythmic and deliberate. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for the doorknob, half expecting it to be ice cold under my fingers. The door swung open with a groan, revealing the attic bathed in shadows. The flashlight beam swept across the room, landing on the typewriter. It was typing. The keys moved on their own, striking the ribbon with mechanical precision. The carriage shifted with each completed line, the sounds sharp and deliberate in the oppressive silence. I stepped closer, drawn despite the overwhelming urge to turn and run. The paper in the typewriter was filled with a single line of text repeated over and over. "Help me." My breath caught in my throat. The air in the attic felt heavier, charged with an unnatural energy. I reached for the paper, my hand trembling, and pulled it free. As soon as I did, the typewriter stopped, the silence almost deafening in its finality. And then I heard it, a low growl, deep and guttural, coming from the forest outside. It wasn't the sound of any animal I recognized. It was something else. Something wrong. I stumbled back down the stairs, slamming the attic door behind me. Darla was waiting at the bottom, her face pale and drawn. "We're leaving," I said, grabbing the car keys and our bags. We fled the cabin that night, not stopping until we were miles away. The growl haunted me long after we left, echoing in my mind whenever the world grew too quiet. I tried to explain everything to Jeremy later, but he brushed it off as a prank or a figment of my imagination. "The cabin's old," he said. "Weird stuff happens in places like that." But I know what I saw. The typewriter sits in a corner of my study now, untouched. I've never tried to type on it again, and I never will. Sometimes late at night, I hear faint whispers in the wind, and I wonder if something followed us home. The carvings on the Remington surface seem to shift in the dim light, forming patterns I can't quite make sense of. They remind me of words, but not in any language I've ever seen. I still collect vintage typewriters, but I'm more cautious now. Some stories are better left untold, and some objects are better left forgotten in dusty attics, and then fading into the distance, only to return moments later. It was relentless, like a predator toying with its prey. Darla and I stayed huddled together, armed with the baseball bat and a carving knife from the kitchen, though we both knew they were little comfort against whatever was out there. When the first light of dawn finally pierced through the gloom, the sounds stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. The tension didn't dissipate. It simply shifted, replaced by a heavy, foreboding stillness that made it hard to breathe. "We're leaving," I said, my voice shaking but resolute. "Pack only what you need. We're not staying another minute." Darla didn't argue. She gathered our things quickly, her movements frantic but focused. I kept watch by the door, gripping the bat tightly, every creak of the cabin making me flinch. As we stepped outside into the pale morning light, the forest looked different. The shadows were still deep, and the air felt heavier, as if the trees themselves were pressing in around us. The footprints from the night before had vanished, leaving no trace of the horror we'd encountered. We reached the car without incident, though every step felt like it might be our last. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that man, or whatever he had become, lurking just out of sight. The drive away from the cabin was silent, the tension between us thick. It wasn't until we were miles away, the oppressive forest replaced by open fields and the safety of civilization, that I dared to speak. "The typewriter," I said, gripping the wheel tightly. "He said it was a gateway, that we had to destroy it." Darla nodded, her face pale. "But it's still in the cabin." I didn't reply. The thought of going back filled me with dread. Whatever was tied to that typewriter, it was no longer our problem. We would call Jeremy, explain what had happened, and let him deal with it. Or maybe we wouldn't. Maybe we would let the cabin and the typewriter fade into obscurity, forgotten and untouched. We never returned to that cabin. Weeks later, Jeremy called, asking if everything had gone okay during our stay. I told him it had been fine, that the place was lovely, but not for us. He laughed, thanked us for taking care of it, and said he'd let the next renters know it was available again. I didn't tell him about the man in the shed or the whispers in the walls. I didn't tell him about the footprints or the strange carvings on the typewriter. Some things are better left unsaid, but sometimes late at night, I still hear faint whispers, like distant conversations, just on the edge of hearing. And sometimes I dream of amber eyes glowing in the dark, watching, waiting. And in those moments, I can't help but wonder if we truly left that place behind, or if it came with us. logically, bolting the doors and securing the windows as if those simple measures could keep out whatever lurked in the forest. The sense of security offered by the cabin's sturdy walls felt paper thin, and none of us were willing to admit just how unnerved we were. That night I couldn't sleep. The events around the fire replayed in my mind, the sound of those deliberate steps echoing in my ears. I lay in bed staring at the wooden beams above, listening for any noise from outside. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again, a low, resonant hum that seemed to seep through the walls. It wasn't loud, but it was pervasive, vibrating in my chest like the growl of some massive, unseen creature. I wasn't the only one awake. The sound must have roused the others too, because soon I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my room. I got up and found Nolan, flashlight in hand, standing near the living room window, peering out into the darkness. Rocco and Quinn joined us moments later, their faces pale in the dim light. "You hear that, right?" Nolan whispered, his voice tight. We all nodded. None of us could explain it, but the sound felt wrong, unnatural in a way that sent primal alarms ringing in our heads. The hum grew louder, shifting in tone until it resembled something almost like chanting. It wasn't coming from one direction, but seemed to emanate from all around us, as if the forest itself was alive and whispering. "What the hell is that?" Rocco hissed, his bravado from earlier completely gone. Nolan shook his head. "I don't know, but I think we need to leave." "Now?" Quinn asked, glancing nervously at the window. "It's the middle of the night. We'll get lost out there." Nolan hesitated but eventually nodded. "Okay. At first light, then. Everyone pack your things and stay together. We're not splitting up." We spent the rest of the night huddled together in the living room, the fireplace crackling weakly in the background. None of us dared to sleep. The chanting, or whatever it was, continued intermittently, growing fainter and then louder, as if circling the cabin. Occasionally we'd hear other noises, faint scratching at the walls, the crunch of leaves underfoot, or what sounded like whispers just outside the windows. When dawn finally broke, the sounds stopped as suddenly as they had started. The forest was eerily still, the morning light struggling to penetrate the dense canopy. We wasted no time. By the time the sun had fully risen, we were already loading our things into the car. As we drove away, none of us spoke. The laughter and camaraderie of the past few days were gone, replaced by an oppressive silence. It wasn't until we were well out of the forest, the cabin far behind us, that I finally allowed myself to breathe freely. Back in Chicago, I tried to rationalize the experience. Maybe it was some natural phenomenon, I told myself. Strange acoustics or the echoes of distant wildlife. But deep down, I knew better. The sound, the presence we'd all felt, wasn't something I could explain away with logic. We never returned to that cabin. Nolan tried to contact the owner to report what we'd experienced, but the number he'd been given was disconnected. A few weeks later, when we looked into the property online, we discovered it had been abandoned for years. The listing Nolan had found no longer existed. Each of us dealt with the aftermath in our own way. Rocco swore off camping entirely, retreating back into the safety of city life. Quinn became obsessed with researching folklore and supernatural phenomena, searching for answers he'd never find. Nolan, always the optimist, tried to move on, but even he couldn't completely shake the fear. As for me, I started hearing things at night, faint, rhythmic humming that seemed to come from nowhere. I dismissed it at first, blaming stress and lack of sleep, but then it grew louder, more insistent, until I couldn't ignore it anymore. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that cabin, about the chanting in the woods and the presence that seemed to follow us home. And I wonder, did we escape that night, or did we bring something back with us? Always drawn to urban areas where the only predators are human ones. I've tried therapy, medication, even hypnosis, but nothing can fully erase the memory of those reflective eyes and that terrible scream. Sometimes late at night, when sleep won't come, I find myself wondering about Rocco. Did he die quickly, or is he out there somewhere, changed by whatever encountered him in that cabin? The forest holds its secrets closely, and some questions are better left unanswered. The cabin still stands. I've checked online occasionally. It's been renovated and is back on the rental market, its dark history carefully omitted from the listing. I wonder about the people who stay there. If they feel something watching them from the trees, if they notice the ancient symbols carved into the porch. I've learned to live with the knowledge that our world is stranger and more dangerous than most people imagine. The comfortable illusions of civilization, our belief that we've tamed the wild places and cataloged all their inhabitants, seem naive to me now. There are things in this world that defy our understanding, creatures that remember when humans were not the apex predators we imagine ourselves to be. For those who might find themselves in similar situations, I offer this advice. Trust your instincts. That prickle on the back of your neck, that feeling of being watched, the sudden silence in the woods. These are warnings written into our DNA by countless generations of ancestors who learned the hard way that humans don't belong everywhere. Some places should remain wild, some territories unmarked, some creatures left to their ancient domains. As for me, I found a measure of peace in sharing my story. Not everyone believes it, of course, but those who have had their own encounters understand. We form a kind of unofficial support group, sharing our experiences in hushed voices over coffee or late-night phone calls. It helps to know we're not alone, that others have glimpsed behind the veil of ordinary reality and live to tell about it. I still have the pictures I took of the stone circle on my phone, though they've never come out clearly, just blurred images that could be anything. Perhaps that's for the best. Some truths are too heavy for evidence, too profound for proof. They can only be carried in memory, passed on in stories whispered as warnings to those who might venture too far from the safety of their known world. The shadow walker, as we've come to call it, remains out there, guarding its territory with ancient patience. Somewhere in the mountains of Colorado, a circle of stones stands in a clearing, waiting for the next group of unsuspecting visitors to stumble upon its secrets. My name is Len Gable, and even now, nearly a decade later, my hands still shake when I think about what happened in those Pennsylvania woods back in 2015. I've spent years trying to make sense of it, questioning my sanity, wondering if I should share this story. But the nightmares won't stop, and maybe putting it down on paper will help me find some peace. I was 42 then, making a modest living as a carpenter in Pittsburgh's South Side, where I'd built a reputation for detailed craftsmanship in home renovations. My days were filled with the familiar rhythm of measuring, cutting, and building, while my weekends were my escape. Time spent at my grandfather's old hunting cabin about 2 hours outside the city near the Allegheny National Forest. The cabin itself wasn't much to look at, a sturdy two-bedroom structure with weather-beaten cedar siding and a tin roof that sang in the rain. But it was mine, inherited from my grandfather along with his old Winchester shotgun and a lifetime of memories. I'd spent countless weekends there over the years, fixing loose boards, replacing shingles, and gradually making it more comfortable without losing its rustic charm. The isolation was what I loved most. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles away, and cell service was spotty at best. It was my retreat from the constant noise and demands of city life, a place where I could hear myself think. That particular weekend in late October started like any other. I'd invited my two oldest friends, Mitch Yates and Dave Bowser, up for some fishing and relaxation. We'd known each other since our days at Carrick High School, where Mitch had been the class clown and Dave the quiet brainiac who helped us pass algebra. Time had changed us all. Mitch now owned a successful plumbing business, his teenage swagger replaced by a comfortable middle-aged spread, while Dave had settled into a career as an accountant, his premature baldness offset by a meticulously maintained goatee. But when we got together, it was like no time had passed at all. The drive up was filled with the usual banter and catch-up conversation. Mitch complained about his ex-wife's latest demands, Dave talked about his daughter's college applications, and I shared stories about my latest renovation project, a Victorian mansion in Shadyside that was turning into a money pit for its owners. The autumn colors were at their peak, painting the hillsides in brilliant shades of red and gold, and the late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the trees as we turned onto the gravel road leading to the cabin. The first sign that something was wrong came when we pulled up to the cabin around 6:30 p.m. The temperature had dropped significantly, and our breath formed clouds in the crisp October air as we unloaded our gear from Mitch's F-150. The cabin looked the same as always, but something felt off, a subtle wrongness that I couldn't quite put my finger on. Maybe it was the unusual silence of the woods, or the way the shadows seemed deeper than normal around the building's foundations. I brushed it off as paranoia and focused on getting settled in. We spent that first evening on the cabin's screened-in porch, drinking beer and sharing stories around the old Coleman lantern. Mitch was in rare form, regaling us with increasingly embellished tales of his glory days, including the infamous story of how he'd fallen into Lake Arthur trying to impress a girl at a summer party back in '89. "Oh, come on, Dave," he protested when Dave brought it up. "That was years ago. Besides, she did give me her number." He grinned and took another pull from his beer. "Yeah," Dave shot back. "And then she gave you mono." We laughed, and for a while everything felt normal and right with the world. The night passed uneventfully, but I had trouble sleeping. The old cabin creaked and settled in ways that seemed unfamiliar, despite my years of staying there. I told myself it was just the changing weather, the wood contracting in the autumn chill, but something about the sounds felt deliberate, almost purposeful. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with shapeless shadows and the sensation of being watched. We were up before dawn the next morning, the cabin filling with the aroma of strong coffee and the sound of Dave's bacon sizzling in the cast iron skillet. The early morning light painted everything in soft grays and blues as we gathered our fishing gear and headed out to our favorite spot, a secluded cove about a mile from the cabin where the lake narrowed and deepened, creating the perfect habitat for bass and pike. The fishing was good that morning, surprisingly good actually. We caught several decent-sized bass and even a monster pike that had Mitch cursing and struggling with his rod for a good 15 minutes before he finally landed it. But there was something unusual about the fish. Their colors seemed off somehow, too pale, and their eyes had a milky, almost opaque quality that I'd never seen before. Dave, who'd been fishing these waters as long as I had, noticed it too, but neither of us said anything at the time. Looking back, I wish we had. It was around noon when we decided to head back to the cabin to clean our catch and grab some lunch. The day had warmed up considerably, but the woods felt different on the return trip. The birds had gone quiet, and the usual rustling of small animals in the underbrush was noticeably absent. We were about 100 yards from the cabin when I stopped dead in my tracks. The front door was standing slightly open, swaying gently in the breeze. My stomach dropped. I knew, absolutely knew, that I'd locked that door before we left. It was a habit ingrained by years of cabin ownership, as automatic as breathing. "Guys, did anyone come back to the cabin while we were fishing?" I asked, already knowing the answer. Mitch and Dave exchanged glances, their expressions mirroring the unease I felt. "No way, Len," Mitch replied, his usual jovial tone replaced by something more cautious. "You were the last one out, remember?" We approached the cabin with the caution of men who'd seen enough horror movies to know better, but were too stubborn to turn back. David picked up a fallen branch, a poor weapon but better than nothing, while Mitch moved with uncharacteristic silence, his usual swagger replaced by tense alertness. The crunch of leaves under our boots seemed impossibly loud in the stillness of the afternoon. The interior. The cabin's interior was a scene of calculated chaos. This wasn't the random destruction of an animal break-in. I'd dealt with those before, usually bears searching for food. No, this was different. Our duffel bags were unzipped and methodically emptied, their contents spread across the floor as if someone, or something, had been studying them. The kitchen cabinet stood open, cans and packages examined and discarded. Most disturbing of all, our phones, left charging on the counter, were neatly arranged in a precise line, screens facing down. "Jesus Christ," Mitch whispered, running a hand through his graying hair. "This isn't kids, Len. Kids trash places. They don't organize things." He was right. There was an unsettling intelligence behind the disarray, a purpose we couldn't understand. Dave moved to check the bedrooms while I examined the doorframe for signs of forced entry. There were none. The lock was intact, undamaged. It was as if whatever had entered had simply passed through solid wood. We spent the next hour putting the cabin back in order, none of us wanting to voice the questions burning in our minds. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows as we worked, and I couldn't shake the feeling that those shadows were watching us, measuring our movements. Our earlier plans to clean and cook the fish were forgotten. None of us had much appetite. As dusk approached, we built a fire in the pit outside, more for comfort than warmth. Nobody wanted to stay inside longer than necessary. We sat close to the flames, our conversation forced and hollow, each of us jumping at every snap of a twig in the surrounding darkness. The woods, once my sanctuary, now felt alien and hostile. Maybe we should call the Rangers, Dave suggested, his voice barely audible over the crackling fire. Report a break-in. Even as he said it, we all knew we wouldn't. What could we tell them? That someone had broken in without breaking anything, rearranged our belongings with bizarre precision, and vanished without a trace? They'd dismiss it as drunk campers playing pranks, if they even bothered to investigate. Around midnight, everything went to hell. The fire had burned low, and we were considering calling it a night when we heard the scream. It came from the direction of the lake, a sound that started human, but twisted into something else. Something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, and my skin break out in goosebumps. It wasn't the scream of someone being attacked or injured. It was the scream of someone seeing something their mind couldn't process. Before we could react, a figure burst from the tree line into the dying firelight. A woman, probably in her early 30s, her hiking clothes torn and muddy. Her eyes were wide with terror, and she was gasping for breath as if she'd been running for miles. "Help me," she managed to choke out before collapsing to her knees. "It's in the water. Oh God, it's in the water." Mitch reached her first, helping her to her feet, while Dave and I scanned the darkness beyond the firelight's reach. Her name was Lisa Marshall. Between sobs, she told us she'd been hiking the trail that skirted the lake's eastern shore. She'd stopped to fill her water bottle when she saw it, something moving beneath the surface. At first, she thought it was a fish or a beaver, but then it turned to look at her. That's when we heard it, that sliding sound from the direction of the lake, accompanied by a deep, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in our bones. Lisa's grip on Mitch's arm tightened, and she began to whimper. I ran into the cabin and grabbed my grandfather's Winchester, checking to make sure it was loaded. When I returned, I saw them, eyes reflecting the firelight from the tree line, but not like any animal's eyes I'd ever seen. They were huge, spaced too far apart, and instead of the usual red or green reflection, they shone with a pale, corpse-light blue. The creature emerged from the shadows with a fluid grace that defied its size. In the flickering firelight, its skin was sickly white, almost translucent, stretched too tight over a frame that constantly shifted and changed shape. It moved on too many limbs, long and spindly, bending in impossible ways. But it was the face that haunted my nightmares for years afterward, if you could call it a face. Where features should have been, there was only a smooth, blank surface, occasionally rippling with suggestions of eyes and a mouth, like something trying to remember what a face should look like. Dave moved first, shoving Lisa toward the cabin while yelling for us to run. The creature's response was immediate and terrifying. Its form seemed to elongate, stretching upward until it towered over us, those pale eyes multiplying and splitting like cells under a microscope. I raised the Winchester and fired.